In the year 3447, humanity was nothing special. At least, that is what the rest of the galaxy believed. They lived on 12 small worlds scattered across a quiet arm of the Milky Way. They had no great warships. They had no planet-killing weapons. They had no engines that could bend space and time. Compared to the older species, the ones who had ruled the stars for millions of years, humans were like children playing in a sandbox while giants walked the earth around them. But humanity had one thing that no other species possessed. One thing that made every empire, every federation, every ancient civilization in the galaxy nervous. They had the sacred lock. It sat deep beneath the surface of Earth's moon, buried under 3 kilometers of solid rock. A team of miners had found it in 2186, completely by accident. They had been drilling for minerals when their machines hit something that should not have been there. Something old. Something impossibly old. The structure was massive. It rose from the lunar bedrock like a tower of pale bone, wrapped in veins of soft golden light that pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat. No one knew who had built it. No one knew what was inside. The best scientists in human history had spent over 1,000 years studying it, and they had learned exactly 2 things. First, the lock was older than human civilization. Dating methods suggested it had been placed inside the moon over 100,000 years ago, long before humans had learned to write or build or dream of the stars. Second, it responded only to humans. Every species in the galaxy had tried to open it. The Vareth had sent their greatest engineers. The Sileni had used quantum resonance tools that could crack open dying stars. The Hollow Collective had attempted to communicate with it through pure mathematics. Nothing worked. But when a human touched its surface, the golden veins would glow brighter. When human children were brought near it, the entire structure would hum, a deep, warm sound, like a parent singing to a sleeping child. Humanity did not know what was inside the lock. They did not try to force it open. Instead, they built a law around it, the oldest and most sacred law in human civilization. They called it the Covenant of Stillness, and it had only 3 lines. The lock shall not be forced. The lock shall not be surrendered. The lock shall open when it is ready. For over 1,000 years, that law held. And for over 1,000 years, the galaxy left humanity alone, not out of respect, but because no one wanted to start a war over something they could not even use. That changed when Archon Thyro-Kas lost his patience. Kas was the supreme ruler of the dominion of Vareth, the largest empire in the known galaxy. 40,000 star systems answered to him. His warships darkened the skies of 100 worlds. He had ruled for 900 years, kept alive by technology that rebuilt his body cell by cell, and in all that time, he had never encountered a door that would not open for him. The sacred lock was the only exception, and it burned in his mind like a splinter he could not remove. He sent his ultimatum on a cold Tuesday morning. It arrived at the Galactic Senate in the form of a simple message. Humanity would hand over the lock within 1 standard rotation, or the Dominion would take it by force. Ambassador Yuan Dao received the message in his small office on the Senate station. He was an old man, 73 years old, with white hair and calm eyes that had seen too much of the galaxy's cruelty. He had spent 30 years keeping humanity alive through words alone. He had smiled when he wanted to scream. He had shaken hands with species that considered humans to be barely above animals. He read the message twice. Then he walked to the Senate floor and asked for help. The Senate chamber was enormous, a hollow sphere filled with floating platforms, each one carrying the representatives of a different species. Dao stood on humanity's platform, the smallest in the room, and he spoke clearly and without anger. He reminded them of the treaties. He reminded them of the laws that were supposed to protect smaller species. He asked them to stand with humanity against the Dominion. The vote took less than an hour. Every species voted to remain neutral. Not one hand was raised in humanity's defense. Dao stood alone on his platform for a long time after the chamber emptied. Then he returned to his office and sent a single message to Earth. "We are on our own." Commander Sira Voss received that message aboard the Terran defense station orbiting Luna. She was 51 years old, tall and lean, with short dark hair and eyes that carried a kind of tiredness that sleep could not fix. 5 years ago, the Vareth had conducted what they called a border correction on one of humanity's colony worlds. Her daughter, 9 years old, had been on that world. The Vareth had not bothered to evacuate civilians before they began their operation. Voss had not spoken her daughter's name since that day. She carried it inside her like a stone. She read Dao's message. She looked at the tactical display showing the space around Earth and Luna. 43 ships. That was all humanity had. 43 small, outdated vessels crewed by men and women who had signed up knowing they would probably never fight a real war. Then the display changed. New signatures appeared, hundreds at first, then thousands. The Vareth Armada dropped out of hyperspace like a curtain falling across the sky. 10,000 warships, each one larger than anything humanity had ever built, arranged in perfect formation above the pale blue curve of Earth. Voss stared at the display for a long time. Around her, the bridge crew was silent. She could hear someone breathing too fast. She could hear someone quietly praying. She opened a channel to her fleet. 43 ships, 43 crews who knew exactly what was coming. "This is Commander Voss," she said. Her voice was steady. "We are not going to win this fight. That is not our job. Our job is to buy time. Every second we hold is a second for the people below. Every second matters." She paused. On her screen, the Vareth Armada began to move. "The lock is dreaming," she said softly, "and I think it is almost awake." She closed the channel and gave the order to advance. 43 ships moved forward to meet 10,000. Below them, the moon hummed. The battle above Luna lasted 6 hours. It should have lasted 6 minutes. Commander Voss knew she could not win. She had never planned to win. But she had spent 28 years in the Terran Defense Force, and she knew how to make a bigger enemy bleed. She split her 43 ships into 6 wolf packs and sent them screaming into the Vareth formation from different angles. The Vareth commanders expected humanity's tiny fleet to form a defensive line and die in place, the way smaller species always did. They were not prepared for ships that charged directly into their ranks like animals with nothing left to lose. The first Wolfpack hit the Vareth right flank and detonated a chain of EMP mines that had been hidden inside a cloud of asteroid debris. 14 Vareth cruisers lost their shields at once. Before they could recover, the human frigates tore through the gap, firing everything they had at point-blank range. 3 Vareth warships broke apart. It was like throwing rocks at a giant. It would not kill him, but it made him flinch. Voss led the second Wolfpack herself. 7 frigates, aimed directly at the center of the Vareth formation, where the command ship sat like a mountain of black metal. Her ships dodged and weaved through a wall of weapons fire that turned the space around them into a storm of light. She lost 2 frigates in the first 30 seconds, then a third, then a fourth. But the remaining 3 reached the command ship's shield array and fired their entire missile reserves into it at once. The shields did not fall, but they flickered. And in that flicker, Voss launched a single modified torpedo, a crude thing, built in a rush, packed with every explosive her engineers could find into the gap. The command ship's forward shield generator exploded. It was a small wound on a very large beast, but it forced the Vareth admiral to pull the command ship back behind a wall of escorts. That single action disrupted the Vareth formation for almost an hour as they reorganized. Voss smiled through broken teeth. Her ship was crippled, engines dead, half the hull open to space, life support failing. She drifted in her command chair, bleeding from a gash across her forehead, and watched her remaining ships continue to fight. They fought like nothing the galaxy had ever seen, not because they were better armed or better trained, but because they were not afraid. Every pilot, every gunner, every engineer on those 43 ships knew they were going to die. And they had decided, somewhere deep in their bones, that their deaths would mean something. One by one, the human ships went dark. Each one took at least 2 Varith vessels with it. Some took more. A frigate called the Anya Kor, crewed by 46 people from a colony world that no one in the galaxy had ever heard of, rammed itself into a Varith carrier at full speed. The carrier, 10,000 times the frigate's mass, broke in half. 6 hours, 43 ships. They destroyed 91 Varith warships and damaged over 300 more. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. But it was 6 hours that the Varith had not been bombing Earth. 6 hours that the people below had to breathe. On Earth, the world was quiet. Billions of people looked up at the sky, where flashes of light told the story of their fleet dying. There was no panic, no riots, no screaming. Something strange and deep had settled over the planet, a calm that had no name, as if the entire species had taken a single breath and was holding it, waiting. Mothers held their children close. Old men stood in open fields and watched the sky with steady eyes. In cities, strangers held hands. No one spoke. It was as if humanity, in its final hour, had remembered something ancient, something written not in books but in blood and bone. Ambassador Yuan Dao stood before the Galactic Senate one last time. Every species in the known galaxy was watching. He was tired. His hands shook slightly, but his voice was clear. "You are watching," he said, "all of you. You are watching a species die because you were too afraid to help. I want you to remember this. Not because I want your guilt, but because you need to remember what comes next." He said nothing more. He turned off his communicator and sat down in his empty office, alone. Above the moon, the last human ship, Voss's crippled frigate, finally went silent. The Varith armada moved toward Luna unopposed. Thousands of Varith shock troops poured onto the lunar surface. They were the most feared soldiers in the galaxy, tall, armored in black, bred and trained for nothing but war. They tore through the underground tunnels leading to the locked chamber like a flood of dark water. Dr. Lena Ortiz heard them coming. She was 58 years old, small and thin, with gray hair pulled back from a face that had spent 30 years squinting at ancient symbols. She was not a soldier. She was not brave in the way soldiers were brave. She was simply stubborn. She had spent her entire life studying the lock, and she was not going to leave it now. Her research team, 11 scientists, most of them barely old enough to have finished their training, stayed with her. They stood in the lock chamber and listened to the sound of boots and weapons growing closer. The lock towered above them, pale and beautiful, its golden veins pulsing faster than Ortiz had ever seen. Her instruments were going wild. Energy readings were climbing. The hum that had been steady for 100,000 years was changing, rising in pitch like a voice building toward a scream. "It knows," she whispered. "It knows what is happening." The chamber doors exploded inward. Varith soldiers flooded the room, weapons raised. And behind them, moving with the slow confidence of a creature that had never known fear, came Archon Thyral Kas himself. He was tall, taller than any human, with skin like polished gray stone and eyes that glowed a dull red. He wore no armor. He did not need armor. He had survived assassination attempts that would have destroyed buildings. He stopped in the center of the chamber and looked up at the lock. For the first time in 900 years, something cold moved through his chest. He did not recognize it as fear. He had forgotten what fear felt like. The lock was beautiful. Even he could see that. It rose above him like a cathedral made of living bone, its golden light reaching for the ceiling, its hum vibrating in his teeth. "Place the charges," he said. His engineers moved forward with resonance devices, weapons designed to shatter materials harder than neutron star cores. They attached them to the lock's surface carefully, methodically. Dr. Ortiz pushed past 2 guards and stood in front of Kas. She was small enough that she barely reached his chest. She looked up at him with eyes that were red from crying. "You do not understand what this is," she said. "It is not a vault. It is not a weapon. It is a cocoon. Something is inside it, and it is growing, and it is almost ready. If you break it now." Kas looked down at her, the way a person might look at an insect. "Fire," he said. The charges detonated. The lock, the structure that had stood for 100,000 years, that had hummed when children came near it, that had waited with impossible patience for this exact moment, shattered like glass. For 3 seconds there was absolute silence. No sound, no light, no air moving, even the dust hung frozen in place. Then the golden light that had lived inside the lock's veins erupted. It moved outward in a wave through the chamber, through the tunnels, through the lunar rock, through space itself. It passed through the Vareth fleet without slowing. It passed through Earth. It passed through every colony world, every station, every ship where a human being drew breath. Every human in the galaxy gasped at the same instant. 19 billion people felt something open inside them, something vast and warm and ancient that had been sleeping in their cells, in their DNA, in the deepest parts of their minds, waiting for exactly this moment. Dr. Ortiz fell to her knees. Her hands were shaking. They were glowing, a faint golden light just beneath her skin, like sunrise seen through closed fingers. She looked up at Archon Kas, and the terror on his face was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She laughed. It was a broken sound, half sob and half joy. "You broke the cocoon," she said. Tears ran down her glowing face. "Thank you." The hum did not stop. It grew louder and louder, and it was no longer coming from the moon. It was coming from everywhere. The change happened to all of them at the same time. A farmer on the colony world of New Gideon was feeding his cattle when his vision blurred, and then cleared in a way it had never been clear before. He could see the individual cells in the grass. He could feel the magnetic field of the planet pressing gently against his skin. He looked up at the sky, and he understood, without being told, without thinking, exactly how far away every star was and what burned inside each one. A girl of 14 on Earth was sitting in her school when the golden wave passed through her. She blinked, and suddenly she could hear the thoughts of her classmates. Not words exactly, but feelings: warm, frightened, confused, amazed. She reached out with her mind and touched them, and they touched her back, and all 30 children in that room began to cry because they could feel how much they were loved and had never known it. A soldier on a transport ship halfway across human space felt his broken arm heal in the time it took him to breathe in and breathe out. He stared at his hand. He opened and closed his fist. Then he looked at the navigation console and realized he could see the mathematics of hyperspace written in the air itself, like golden threads woven through the fabric of reality. It was not magic, it was not a miracle, it was something much older. The lock had been built by humans, not the humans who lived now, a previous version of humanity, a civilization so far beyond the current one that comparing them was like comparing an ocean to a puddle. They had risen millions of years ago. They had spread across the galaxy. They had unlocked every secret of matter and energy and thought. They had become something close to gods. And then they had made a choice that no other species in the history of the universe had ever made. They looked at what they had become, and they decided it was not earned. Power without struggle was empty. Wisdom without suffering was shallow. Transcendence without the long, painful, beautiful process of growing into it was meaningless. So they locked it away. They took everything they were, every gift, every ability, every piece of knowledge, and they sealed it inside a cocoon of their own making. They placed it inside the moon of a small blue world, and then they started over. They became small, fragile, mortal. They forgot everything. They left behind only the lock and a single instruction coded into the DNA of every human being who would ever be born. When the cocoon breaks, remember. And now it had broken, and they remembered. Commander Sira Voss floated in the wreckage of her ship, alone in the dark. Half her crew was dead. The other half was barely alive, sealed in emergency pods scattered through the broken hull. Her right arm was useless. Blood drifted in small red spheres around her face. Then the wave hit her. The pain vanished. Not slowly, not gently, it simply stopped, as though someone had turned off a switch. Her arm straightened. The gash on her forehead closed. She drew a breath that felt like the first real breath she had ever taken. And then she saw the Varith fleet. Not with her eyes, with something deeper. She could see every ship, all 10,000 of them, as clearly as if they were pieces on a board game laid out before her. She could see their shield frequencies. She could see the energy patterns in their engines. She could see the communication signals running between them like threads of light. And she could see the weaknesses. Hundreds of them. Thousands. She reached out with her mind and found her surviving crew. 17 people, scattered through the wreckage. She touched each of them not physically, but in the space behind their thoughts, and they touched her back. 17 minds linked together, thinking as one. "I see it," whispered her first officer, a young man named Kalen from inside an emergency pod 3 decks away. "I see all of it." They did not have a working ship. They had half a frigate with 3 functioning weapons, but they had 17 awakened minds, and that was enough. Voss reached into the Varith communication network. It was not difficult. The signals were crude, like trying to build a wall out of sand. She moved through their systems the way water moves through cloth, finding the gaps, slipping through. In less than a minute, she had mapped the entire command structure of the Varith armada. Then she began to take it apart. She did not destroy ships. She did not kill anyone. She simply disconnected things. A weapons array here, a shield generator there, a navigation system on the flagship. Each action was precise, surgical, invisible. The Varith crews did not understand what was happening. Their systems were failing one by one, and there was no enemy to shoot at. On Earth, the awakening was even more dramatic. Billions of people were changing at the same time, and the things they could do with their new abilities were beyond anything the galaxy had imagined. An engineer in Mumbai who had spent 10 years struggling to improve a basic fusion reactor sat down at her workstation and solved the problem of zero-point energy in 20 minutes. She stared at her own equations and laughed because they were so simple. They had always been simple. She just had not been able to see it before. A doctor in Sao Paulo placed his hands on a dying patient and felt the cancer inside her, every cell of it, every mutation, every wrong instruction in her DNA. He corrected them, not with medicine, not with surgery, with understanding so deep and complete that the disease simply stopped. An artist in Kyoto picked up a brush and painted something that made every person who saw it weep, not from sadness, from recognition. The painting showed what humanity had been before it forgot, a civilization of light and purpose, vast beyond imagination, choosing to become small because it believed that smallness had a beauty all its own. Back on Luna, the Varith shock troops were in chaos. Dr. Lena Ortiz moved through the tunnels beneath the moon's surface like a ghost. She was not alone. Her team of 11 scientists moved with her, and they moved in perfect coordination, their minds linked, their steps silent. They could feel the Varith soldiers before they saw them. They could sense the electrical impulses in their muscles, the patterns in their thoughts. They did not fight. They did not need to. Ortiz would approach a squad of armed Varith soldiers, the most feared warriors in the galaxy, and she would simply reach into their weapon systems with her mind and turn them off. The soldiers would stare at their dead guns in confusion, and by the time they looked up, the scientists were already gone. In the shattered lock chamber, Archon Ka stood surrounded by golden dust and broken light. He had not moved since the lock broke. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the way the air hummed. He could feel it in the way his own soldiers' voices shook when they reported in. He could feel it in the way the universe itself seemed to have shifted slightly on its axis, as though something that had been sleeping for a very long time had just opened its eyes. He tried to order a planetary bombardment of Earth. Burn it. Burn everything. If the lock was gone, there was no reason to hold back. His order went nowhere. His communications were dead. His fleet was going dark, ship by ship, like candles being blown out by a wind he could not see. Footsteps echoed in the chamber. He turned. Dr. Ortiz walked toward him through the golden dust. She was small. Her hair was gray. Her lab coat was torn and stained with blood, but her eyes glowed with a light that Cass had never seen in any species in 900 years of conquest. She stopped 3 meters away from him and looked up at his face with an expression he did not understand. It was pity. "Your empire sent 10,000 ships to our sky," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of something enormous behind it, like a whisper backed by thunder. "Would you like to know how many ships we need to stop them?" Cass said nothing. His red eyes burned. Ortiz held up one hand, fingers spread wide. "None," she said. Above them, in the silence of space, the Vareth armada drifted without power, without weapons, without hope. 10,000 warships, crewed by millions of soldiers, rendered completely helpless by 17 people in a broken frigate and a handful of scientists who had never held a gun. On Earth, 19 billion people looked up at the sky with golden eyes. They were awake. The galaxy expected blood. It expected revenge. It expected humanity to do what every species in history had done when it gained power over its enemy, to burn, to conquer, to make the Vareth scream the way humanity had screamed. Humanity did something worse than any of that. It showed mercy. In the 72 hours after the awakening, the Vareth armada sat dead in the sky above Earth. 10,000 warships with no weapons, no engines, no way to call for help. Millions of Vareth soldiers floated in their darkened ships, waiting for the killing blow that every instinct told them was coming. It never came. Instead, human ships, small, golden-veined vessels that hummed with the same warm light that had once lived inside the lock, drifted alongside the Vareth warships and restored their life support systems. Nothing else. Just air and heat and water, just enough to keep them alive. Commander Voss sent a single message to every Vareth ship on an open channel. Her voice was calm. There was no anger in it. There was no triumph. "Your weapons will remain offline," she said. "Your engines will remain offline, but you will breathe. You will eat. You will be safe. When this is over, you will go home." Some Vareth commanders wept. They did not understand why. No species had ever done this to them. They had conquered hundreds of worlds, and they knew exactly what the powerful did to the powerless. This was not in the script. On Earth, humanity was building. Not weapons, not warships, something else entirely. Engineers who had struggled for decades with basic power systems now understood energy at its deepest level. They built generators that drew power from the fabric of space itself, clean, limitless, free. Doctors who had spent their careers fighting diseases now saw the human body the way an artist sees a canvas, every cell a brushstroke, every system a symphony. They began curing things that had been considered permanent. And they did all of this in the open. Every discovery, every breakthrough, every solution was shared freely on channels that the entire galaxy could access. Humanity was not hiding. It was not building in secret. It was showing everyone, without being asked, exactly what it could do. The Galactic Senate watched in silence. The species that had voted to abandon humanity 72 hours ago now sat in their floating chambers and stared at their screens with something that looked very much like shame. Within a week, humanity had reverse-engineered and improved Vareth hyperspace technology. What had once taken the Vareth centuries to develop, human minds unraveled in an afternoon. New ships began taking shape in Earth's orbital yards, sleek and elegant, wrapped in veins of golden light. humming with a frequency that made other species feel a strange and nameless comfort, like hearing a lullaby from childhood they had never actually been sung. 40 ships. That was all humanity built. 40, to match the 43 that had died defending Luna. Each one was crewed by people whose minds worked as one, who could see probability itself, who could reach across space with their thoughts and touch the systems of any machine ever built. Commander Voss stood on the bridge of the lead ship, the Sierra, named not by her but by her crew, who had felt the stone she carried inside her and wanted her to know they carried it too. She looked at the star map and set a course for Vareth Prime. The 40 ships crossed the galaxy in 3 days, a journey that would have taken the Vareth fleet 6 months. When they arrived above Vareth Prime, every alarm on the planet screamed at once. 300 billion Vareth citizens looked up at their sky and saw 40 small golden ships hanging in orbit like stars that had wandered too close to the ground. They waited for the bombs. They waited for the fire. Their Archon had told them for centuries that other species were savage, that they understood nothing but force, that the Dominion was the only shield between civilization and chaos. Instead, Commander Voss broadcast a message that reached every screen, every speaker, every device on the planet. "People of the Dominion," she said, "your Archon sent 10,000 ships to destroy something sacred. He killed our defenders. He shattered a gift that had waited 100,000 years to be opened, and in doing so, he gave us back what we had forgotten we were." She paused. 300 billion people held their breath. "We are not here for revenge. We are here to show you what we choose to do with the power your Archon accidentally gave us." The golden ships opened their lower bays. Devices unlike anything the Vareth had ever seen descended toward the planet's surface. They were not weapons. They were atmospheric restoration systems, machines that could repair a dying world. Vareth Prime was dying. It had been dying for centuries. The Archon had strip-mined his own homeworld to fuel his war machine, poisoning the air, killing the oceans, turning fertile land into gray dust. His people had suffered in silence because they were more afraid of him than they were of slow suffocation. The human machines began to work. Within hours, the sky above the Vareth capital, which had been a haze of brown and gray for as long as anyone could remember, began to clear. Within days, the air tasted different, cleaner. Within a week, green things began to grow in soil that had been dead for generations. The Vareth people watched this happen with an emotion they had no word for. Some of them cried. Some of them sat on the ground and touched the new grass with trembling fingers, as though they were afraid it would disappear. Children ran through fields that had been wasteland the week before and laughed at the sky, which was turning blue for the first time in their lives. Humanity asked for nothing in return. Not territory, not resources, not loyalty, not even an apology. This was the thing that broke the Vareth Dominion. Not the 40 golden ships, not the impossible technology, not the demonstration of power so far beyond anything the galaxy had seen that it made the mightiest empires look like collections of sticks and mud. It was the mercy. It was the absolute, unshakable, unreasonable mercy. Because mercy, when given by someone who has every right and every power to destroy you, is the most terrifying thing in the universe. It says, "I could end you, and I choose not to, and there is nothing you can do to change either of those facts." The Dominion subject species, dozens of civilizations that had been conquered and crushed over millennia, saw what humanity was doing and something inside them shifted. They did not rebel with weapons. They simply stopped obeying. Entire sectors went quiet. Ships refused to fly. Workers refused to work. Governors refused to govern. The empire, built on 900 years of fear, discovered that fear has an expiration date. And when it expires, there is nothing underneath it. No loyalty, no love, no reason for anyone to do what they are told. Archon Kas was brought before a tribunal on his own homeworld. Not a human tribunal. His own people demanded it. He stood in a courtroom filled with Vareth citizens who had breathed clean air for the first time in their lives, who had watched alien ships heal their world while their own ruler had been poisoning it, and who looked at their 900-year-old God Emperor and saw him clearly for the first time. He was just an old man who had been afraid of a door. Ambassador Yuan Dao stood before the Galactic Senate one final time. His eyes carried the faint golden glow that every human's eyes now carried. The Senate chamber was silent. Every species watched. "You asked us for centuries what was behind the lock," he said. "Now you know it was us. It was always us. The version of ourselves we had not yet earned the right to become. The Vareth broke the lock, but we will decide what we do with what was inside." He looked at each platform in turn, at the species that had turned their backs, at the empires that had chosen comfort over justice, at the civilizations that had watched humanity die and done nothing. "We choose to build," he said. The chamber was silent for a long time. Then, from a small platform in the back, the representative of the Sileni, a species so old they had been ancient when the Vareth were still learning to use fire, a single voice spoke. "We are sorry," it said. Dao looked at the Sileni representative with eyes that glowed like small suns. "We know," he said gently. "Help us build, that will be enough." 1 year passed. The galaxy became something new. The Vareth dominion was gone. Not destroyed, dissolved, the way ice dissolves in warm water, quietly and completely. There was no final battle, no last stand. The empire simply stopped existing because the idea that held it together, that the strong must rule the weak, that fear was the only real currency, had been proven false in a way that could not be argued with. Archon Thyral Kas lived on a barren moon at the edge of what had once been his territory. He was not imprisoned. There were no guards, no chains, no locked doors. Humanity had simply left him there with food, shelter, and silence. That was the cruelest kindness of all. He had spent 900 years preparing for enemies. He had built defenses against invasion, rebellion, assassination. He had imagined 1,000 ways his empire might end, in fire, in war, in betrayal. He had never imagined it would end because someone was kind to his people, and his people realized they preferred kindness to fear. He sat on the surface of his dead moon and stared at the stars and understood, finally, what Dr. Ortiz had tried to tell him in the locked chamber. He had not broken a vault. He had broken a shell. And the thing that had hatched from it was beyond anything his 900-year-old mind could contain. He was not angry. He was not afraid. He was simply small in a galaxy that had suddenly grown very, very large. Across that galaxy, humanity was keeping its promise. They called it the Open Architecture Initiative, and it was exactly what it sounded like. Every piece of technology that awakened humans had developed, the zero-point energy systems, the molecular fabrication tools, the atmospheric restoration machines, the medical techniques that could cure diseases that had plagued civilizations for millennia, all of it was given away. Freely, without conditions, without contracts, without the expectation of anything in return. Worlds that had starved for centuries began to grow food in abundance. Species that had been dying out found their populations stabilizing. Planets that had been stripped bare by the Vareth war machine began to heal, their skies clearing, their oceans returning, their dead soil coming back to life. Some species were suspicious. They looked for the hidden cost, the secret agenda, the trap buried inside the gift. They had lived in a galaxy where nothing was free, where every act of generosity was a transaction in disguise. They found nothing. There was no trick. Humanity was simply giving because it could, and because it remembered in its bones, in the golden light that hummed through its collective mind, what it felt like to have nothing and to face the dark alone. The Resonance Network was humanity's second gift. It was a communication system that spanned the entire galaxy, but it was not like anything that had come before. It did not just carry words or images. It carried feeling, understanding. When a Varith farmer spoke through the network to a Sileni elder, they did not just hear each other's words, they felt each other's lives. The weight of centuries of war. The taste of clean air breathed for the first time. The sound of a child laughing in a field that had been dead the year before. Species that had been enemies for 10,000 years began to understand each other. Not agree. Understanding and agreement are different things, but understanding was enough. It was enough to stop the killing. It was enough to make them curious about each other instead of afraid. And then humanity did the thing that changed the galaxy forever. They began planting new locks. Dr. Lena Ortiz led the project. She had spent the year since the awakening studying what the lock had been and how it had worked, tracing the design back through 100,000 years of dormancy to the ancient civilization that had created it. She understood now, truly understood, what humanity's ancestors had done and why. They had not simply locked away their own power. They had designed a process, a path. The lock was not just a container, it was a test, a teacher, a cocoon that could only be opened when the species inside it had grown enough to handle what it held. It was a gift that could not be stolen or forced. It could only be earned. And there was no reason it had to be only for humans. The new locks were different. Each one was tailored to a specific species, to their biology, their psychology, their unique potential. A lock for the Sileni, who had lived so long they had forgotten how to dream. A lock for the Hollow Collective, whose mathematical minds had never learned to feel. A lock for a dozen other species, each one carrying the seed of something extraordinary, something that had been sleeping inside them since the day their kind first looked up at the stars and wondered. Humanity did not force these gifts on anyone. The locks were placed on neutral worlds in open space with a simple message attached. This is yours when you are ready. We will wait. Some species approached their locks immediately, curious and eager. Others stayed away, frightened of what they might become. A few pretended the locks did not exist. It did not matter. The locks were patient. They had learned that from the original. On Earth, in a quiet village on the coast of what had once been called Portugal, Commander Sira Voss sat on the porch of a small stone house and watched the Atlantic Ocean move against the shore. She had retired from the fleet 6 months ago. She had given her ship to Kalen, her first officer, the young man who had cried on the bridge above Varith Prime, and she had come here, to this place where the air smelled like salt and the light was golden in the evenings. She could still feel them. 19 billion minds humming together across 12 worlds and beyond, a chorus of thought and feeling that never stopped. If she wanted to, she could reach out and touch any one of them. She could feel Kalen on the bridge of the Sira, running patrol near the Galactic Rim. She could feel Dow in the Senate chamber, patient as stone. She could feel Ortiz on a distant world, kneeling beside a new lock, checking its readings with the same careful hands that had once studied the original. She did not reach out. Not today. Today she just watched the waves. A child from the village walked up the path to her house. A girl, maybe 7 years old, with dark hair and brown eyes and bare feet dusty from the road. She was not afraid of Voss. Children were never afraid of the awakened. They seemed to understand, better than adults, that the golden light behind human eyes was not something to fear. The girl sat on the step below Voss and looked at the ocean for a while. What did it feel like, she asked, when the lock broke? Voss was quiet for a long time. The waves moved in and out. A bird sang somewhere in the olive trees behind the house. It felt like waking up from a dream where I had forgotten my own name, she said. And then someone handed me a mirror and I saw my face and I thought, there I am. There I have been all along. The girl thought about this. Were you scared? She asked. Voss looked at her. The girl's eyes were brown and clear and full of the kind of fearless curiosity that only children possess. Yes, Voss said, but not of what I became. I was scared of what I might do with it. That was the real test. That was always the real test. And you passed. Voss looked back at the ocean. She thought about the 43 ships that had died above Luna. She thought about the Vareth soldiers drifting in their dark ships, waiting for death, receiving air instead. She thought about green fields growing on a world that had been gray for centuries. She thought about her daughter, whose name she could finally speak again, not because the pain was gone, but because the pain had become something she could carry without breaking. "I think we did," she said. The girl smiled and ran back down the path toward the village. Voss watched her go. Then she closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair and let the sound of the ocean fill the space behind her thoughts. Far away, farther than any living species had ever traveled, deep in the burning heart of the galaxy, something ancient stirred. It was a structure, bone-white, laced with golden veins, larger than a moon. It had been drifting in the light of a dying star since before the Milky Way had finished forming, patient beyond any measure of patience that the word could contain. On its surface, in a script that no known species could read, a single line of text glowed faintly, growing brighter with each passing day. "When the youngest remember, the eldest shall wake." The hum, deep and warm and older than light itself, grew louder. And somewhere on a small blue world at the edge of the galaxy, 19 billion golden minds felt it, all at once, like the first note of a song they had always known but never heard. They looked up. They smiled. And they waited.